From the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the University of Missouri, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. The United States is an open society with an open system of government. That means the press and ordinary people have the right to scrutinize how our leaders make decisions. The idea is that when government officials make poor choices or act purely in their own self-interest, their actions are brought to light. But that doesn't mean everything the government does should be public. Most everyone agrees that what the FBI knows about the mafia or what the military knows about the locations of Russia's nuclear submarines should be kept secret. But beyond issues of imminent threats to national security, there is an ongoing debate over how much government business should be conducted in the open. How many meetings by agencies like the FDA or the FCC should be held in public? How many government records should be accessible to anyone who requests them? And when does having the cameras rolling encourage politicians to grandstand rather than compromise? Today, on a special edition of Global Journalist, we bring you a debate on government transparency. Joining us in studio is Bruce Kane. He's a professor of political science at Stanford University and the author of the book Democracy More or Less: America's Political Reform Quandary. He argues that too much transparency is actually bad for governance. We also welcome back to the program Charles Lewis. He's the founder of the investigative news agency, the Center for Public Integrity. He's currently a journalism professor and the executive editor of the Investigative Reporting Workshop at American University. Welcome to both of you. Bruce Kane, I wanted to ask you, you say that determining the right amount of democratic transparency in a government is surprisingly complicated. Tell us why.
It's complicated because you have to balance the procedural purity of having more open government with government effectiveness. It's possible to make two kinds of mistakes. You can have too little transparency, which is the problem in many developing democracies and in the early stages of the democratic democracy in countries like the United States. But you can also now, in more advanced stages of democracy, have too much transparency. And if you create democratic opportunities and citizens don't take advantage of them, but special interests do, you can get transparency capture, and that can skew policies.
Charles Lewis, you heard Bruce talking about transparency capture. What does that mean? Is that a real risk for American government?
I guess as a journalist, I'm always trying to find out information about government, and I noticed that it's not easily done, and it takes a long time, and sometimes years to get your information you requested, and there are a number of exemptions. Certain powerful forces in our society are not required at all to disclose. So I actually, that's not a big concern of mine. I don't agree that it's a big problem.
Well, what do you mean? Maybe if you can explain to our listeners just a little bit more about what is this idea of transparency capture of a government body, if you would.
So first of all, let's make clear that transparency isn't just being able to ask the government for documents. That's an important piece of it, but it's not the only piece of it. Secondly, remember that transparency requirements are all throughout every level of government: local government, state government, and federal government. So to focus simply on the federal government is a mistake. So the problem can happen because in addition to requesting documents, we have, for example, a lot of laws that require that government agencies meet in the open, that they post agendas in advance, that people can come and watch and observe the proceedings, that they can make suggestions of the proceedings, and that in the end this can affect the final implementation of laws. Well, in reality, you go to everything from city council meetings to regulatory hearings that the Corps of Engineers has, and you're not going to see members of the public there unless something is affecting them directly. Most of the time you're going to see interest groups, either developers or nonprofits or people with an axe to grind. And so they're the ones that are taking advantage of these situations. That's the capture part. And they're using these democratic opportunities that were created with the public in mind. Our romantic notion that, John Q. Citizen would show up fails us. And these people are able to use these opportunities to change the way governments make choices, sometimes completely undoing or negating laws that were passed, decades ago.
Chuck, Bruce says that, in effect, special interests are using open meetings in order to sort of capture the process in some instances and thereby sort of take control of governance from sort of the broader public. Is that something you see?
We've had factions and special interests since 1789 that have always wanted to influence things in various ways. The difference is we occasionally can actually attend some of the meetings now, unlike the first several decades or even more than that of U.S. history. So I think there's a case-by-case thing here. Many lawmakers find ways, discreet ways over lunch and things like that, to talk to each other. Not every municipality has these rules, and there rarely has anyone ever been prosecuted that I'm aware of for actually violating those rules. So it's hard for us to sit here and generalize, either one of us, about the U.S. and the 3,400 counties and even furthermore thousands of municipalities, what each one of them has. So anyway, I think it's case by case. I've talked to federal officials, and it depends on the agency. Obviously, the Federal Reserve has trickier and more strict rules than some other agencies at the federal level. I've also pulled financial disclosures for every lawmaker in the United States at the state level, and some states didn't have those, by the way. So to me, it's a bit of an uneven picture, and I've not drawn any kind of conclusions from that.
Well, let me say a couple things. First of all, yes, it is complicated, and that's why I call my book Democracy More or Less. And I think the problem is that many people in the press and many advocates for political reform have only one gear, which is more transparency, more opportunities for democratic participation. And I'm asking them to stop and reflect and realize that just more is not the right answer. That's not to retreat, obviously, on fundamental rights about requesting documents, but it is to say that it is a problem. And you say, well, nobody's really prosecuted. Well, actually, there's a very interesting case in Los Angeles where a district attorney coming into the county decided he would prosecute a group of people from a city council who, at a barbecue, formed a quorum accidentally and started to discuss business that was in the city council. He then brought in his officers. They went into people's homes armed to look for documents and to prosecute that case. So yes, it's rare, but that's the time to start thinking about these things, to realize that if we don't have these laws properly constructed, we're setting up a situation in which we're ruining the deliberation of governmental bodies for the sake of a romantic notion which citizens can't live up to.
Well, Chuck, if I could turn you to one of the main sort of vehicles for open government, at least at the federal level, and that's the Freedom of Information Act passed back in the Johnson administration. Many people, particularly journalists, argue that it's not effective. My own experience is that it's easy for anyone to file a Freedom of Information Act request. It's very hard to actually get anything tangible from the government as a result of that. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I think that I'm glad we have a federal act. It took them 12 to 15 years to get it enacted in the first place, grudgingly approved by Lyndon Johnson in 1966. Most people that file Freedom of Information requests are companies trying to find out about other companies. It does usually take a very long time. There's 9 exemptions. Congress and the White House, including the entire White House, all the offices and executive branch, executive offices there are exempt from Freedom of Information Act. And so when you look at all the exemptions and you look at the length of time and you look at who's actually asking it, there are many problems with it. There's no question. It usually takes years in many cases to get your information, if you get it at all. So it's then hard for me to comprehend that it's oppressive to a lot of folks. And I also know companies can also quash any interest. I've had companies come into the federal government and block access because they don't think it would work out for their public relations for their company. So I see all kinds of problems with it. It does not mean I don't think it. I think what we have is better than nothing, and weakening those laws worries me.
A reminder to our listeners that you're listening to Global Journalist. Today, a special debate on government secrecy. Joining us in studio are Bruce Kane, a professor of political science at Stanford University and author of the book Democracy More or Less, America's Political Reform Quandary. Also joining us is Charles Lewis, the founder of the Center for Public Integrity and executive editor of the Investigative Reporting Workshop at American University. His most recent book is 935 Lies, The Future of Truth and the Decline of America's Moral Integrity. Bruce Kane, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to what Chuck was saying about the Freedom of Information Act.
Look, I think that the Freedom of Information Act is an important piece of legislation. But that said, I think we have to go beyond saying there are problems, but we're going to disregard them and we're just going to go on and keep the law the way it is. The reality is that, as Chuck said, that most of the people that use these FOIA laws, they're either companies or opposition researchers. There aren't many people making requests like that have sort of public policy importance. So the law isn't the romantic notion that we thought it is. It's not actually thousands of reporters making requests. The number of reporters that take the time to do investigative reporting is, alas, very small and declining. That's the reality. And so what you have is many opposition researchers for candidates using the FOIA law to do a fishing expedition. Well, I have no problem with that, except that as a taxpayer, you're paying for people that don't necessarily have a clear idea what they're looking for and are not necessarily using it for the public purpose. So I think the idea is not to close down the law or to change any of the exemptions, but we've got to figure out a way to put this thing on a budget, because a lot of agencies are hard-pressed to provide this information. And should they really be helping companies that are trying to find other company secrets? That's actually the motive most of the time. It's not to protect their image, it's to find out secrets from other
So you're saying, in other words, the government should prioritize who they are performing FOIA searches for, who they're searching through their records to turn over.
Yes,
That
exactly.
seems like that's very tricky.
Well, it is tricky, and it's not something that we necessarily want the government to think by itself. It's something we should all be thinking about. We should be deciding, how does John Q. Citizen get to make 350 requests for some bizarre paranoid theory they have about government? No. I mean, the answer is, yeah, you give this paranoid person 1 or 2 requests, but you should be able to say no after that. But we don't have any way, no stopping rule. Every agency has to decide it themselves because we're not giving them any help.
Well, Chuck, you talk about institutionalized lying as a feature of our government now. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's a case where I think I was referring to something like the Iraq War, where public officials, 8 of them, all said the same thing on the same day for almost 2 years, or we tracked it exactly for 2 years. Actually, the invasion of Iraq was more like 18 months, but the lead up. But you could actually track the statements, the syntax, the dates that it was said, and there was substantial information that they were not mentioning, and internal dissent, et cetera, that they were not mentioning. And so that's a case where the press secretary quit and said that he felt that he had been told to lie by the president. So that came out after our massive report of 380,000 word data set of all the statements and things. So that's one case, but I actually looked at the Vietnam War. We didn't find out the truth till the Pentagon Papers came out, and that was not freedom of information. It was before the act was enacted, and it was a leak. But we did find out that, oh, by the way, we had been violating the air, land, and water space of North Vietnam against international law, and that we were not attacked at all. Quite the opposite. We attacked them. We didn't find that out till 1971. We, meanwhile, lose 30 or 40,000.
Right. I just want to remind our listeners that
Yeah.
that one of the incidents that triggered the Vietnam War was called the Gulf of Tonkin incident,
Yes,
where a
yes.
U.S. naval ship was allegedly attacked,
Right.
and that triggered the U.S. response. In fact, several years later, we learned that was not the case.
In 2005, the National Security Agency acknowledged there was no attack. It took a few years, I would say 40 years.
But how does this relate to the current debate today? Is there a particular legal or legislative fix that could help us resolve some of these issues?
Well, I mean, those issues. I don't know that anyone if they're trying to roll back the freedom of information laws. I'm not sure how anxious they are to have the White House or increased. There's still a sense about national security in this country, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. Would journalists like that? Sure. Is it likely? Probably not.
And Bruce, in your writings, you distinguish in part between what journalists would like and what's in the interest of journalists and what's in the interest of the broader public when talking about transparency. Tell us a little bit about that and the relative distinction between transparency and government decision making, sort of before a decision is made, when it's made, and then afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important distinction is between the before and after versus the in-process transparency. So in-process transparency means that you're interested in the deliberations, you're interested in people, how they made their decisions, why they may have changed whether they've changed their mind, or if they're lying at any given moment of time. And the problem with that is that when you put the scrutiny on people when they're making decisions, you're going to change the way they make decisions, particularly if there are groups that are paying close attention to this that don't want you to back down. And you can see this in the way elections go, that if people who favored some action going into the war and then changed their mind, or favored a certain version of bill and then change, they get pilloried basically for inconsistency. And people know that. People know that their eyes are on them, and it changes the nature of the discussion. So if we really want a system in which people negotiate, people bargain, people compromise, we can't constantly have the lights on, because the glare of publicity changes the way people behave.
But in a democratic society, if the voters wanted people who would negotiate and compromise, wouldn't they elect people who would negotiate and compromise? Maybe people are getting exactly what they deserve.
Well, at some level they are. To be honest, as Chuck and others have pointed out, these laws don't actually cover Congress. Congress has the ability to actually cut deals and deliberate. But there's no guarantee just because they have that ability they'll do it, although we've had some examples in recent months where the Congress has been able to compromise. No, the problem is that legislatures tend to impose stricter rules on the people below them, on the FACA rules for committees and commissions of the Congress, or of the government rather, or local governments. And so that's where you're really ruining a lot of deliberative processes. There was a bill just recently proposed in the Congress that would do the same thing to the Fed, that would give much more control of the Congress over the Fed. So we have to resist the tendency to keep making the same mistake and to transport the overly strict rules that we have at certain levels of government to all levels of government.
Chuck, did you want to respond to that?
Sure. I think in the case of the Federal Reserve, it took 5 years to acknowledge the BCCI scandal, where 50,000 people were defrauded, and their regulatory ability is not terribly impressive for the role that they play in that regard. There could be some transparency there. I also recognize the sensitivity of the decisions of the Fed, and realize in some of those instances it should not be public, and it would actually damage democracy. I mean, I'm a responsible citizen. I know the difference, but I think a lot of journalists and a lot of academics, including historians, want to know how the decisions were made. And we have to wait 20, 30, 40, 50 years to find out what happened. And I also think that's unacceptable, frankly. So I think we need to know how our society functions, and we need to know it in a reasonable amount of time. And frankly, we don't know it usually.
If you've just tuned in, you're listening to Global Journalist from the Missouri School of Journalism. Today, a special debate on transparency and secrecy in government. Joining us in studio are Bruce Kane of Stanford University and Charles Lewis of the Investigative Reporting Workshop at American University. A reminder that if you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read our ongoing series of interviews with journalists in exile around the world and coverage of foreign affairs and press freedom issues. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Global Journ. Chuck Lewis, one of the issues that you've identified in your writing as a particularly salient one these days is the overclassification of information by government. Now, tell us just a little bit about how you view that.
Well, the overclassification. I mean, President Obama classified 78 or 77 million documents in 2013, more than any president in U.S. history. We are overclassifying. It's in the billions. I don't know the number that have been classified, but there is a problem here, folks, and we don't generally know what goes on in that sphere. There's 16 intelligence agencies. We don't know what their budgets are, which is, I don't know, call me crazy, taxpayer money. It seems like it's not unreasonable to know some of these things, and we should know them sometime in our lifetimes. And so I think there's a number of cases of overclassification, and then there's a lot of cases of powerful forces in American society that have no rules and regulations about transparency. I'm thinking about, I don't know, the two political parties that decide who's going to run for our major offices. They're private institutions, not in the Constitution, but they basically have a fundamental role in democracy. So I look at all the things where we don't have any information or very little that's required. And then I can't understand why we're worrying about too much sunshine. It's not something I worry about.
Well, Bruce, let me turn it to you. You say that in sort of the current bitterly divided political environment, this sort of exacerbates some of the problems with open meeting laws and open records laws. Tell us about that.
Well, again, it goes back to the point that Chuck is not the example of the person that's most likely to use these information laws. The people that are looking for documents, say on Hillary, are not looking at it from some point of view most of the time of some deception or lying, although the ostensible reason for looking at the emails was the Benghazi. But you went to the hearing, if you listen to the hearings had very little to do with that. They spent a lot of time talking about who she was getting her advice from, or what Hollywood stars she wanted to meet. So the reality is that there is a problem, and maybe it isn't the responsibility of the journalist community to think about that, but it is the responsibility of those of us in academia to think about it. Somebody's got to think about it. Because the reality is that, let's take the national security. That's a tough issue. I mean, Chuck's absolutely right about that. But the reality is there is a real downside to disclosing information that the government wants to keep secret. Take, for example, the leaks out of the Obama administration in relationship to the closing down of the Iranian nuclear devices through some sort of hacking technique that the government did. Well, that was not helpful to know that stuff. Or the WikiLeaks, that was not helpful for governments to know what we were doing. Now, it is useful it's a hard case because, yes, we have to hold officials accountable, but in order to protect our interests, sometimes officials have to keep secrets from us, and sometimes they have to lie to other governments. That's the reality. And so it's a hard balance, but I think you got to think about it in an even-handed way if you're going to get to the right answer. You can't simply say, well, we need more and more.
Chuck, you mentioned that WikiLeaks, some of these other leaks from the Obama administration had been potentially harmful to the U.S.
It's not clear to me they were hugely harmful. I think we had a case in the 60s or 70s with Philip Agee, who revealed CIA personnel and they were assassinated. That was harmful. It took the New York Times a year to decide to publish the domestic surveillance story about the National Security Agency spying on millions of Americans electronically. I happen to think that was a useful story to be told after 9/11. I think the public had a right to know that there was systematic attempt to eavesdrop on phone calls. I actually think that was a public service, and I was happy they won a Pulitzer Prize for that. So I think it's case by case, to be honest, on all of these. I have room for discretion and withholding and all that, but I know the New York Times was begged almost by the President of the United States not to publish a domestic surveillance story, and they were afraid they would block publication like the Pentagon Papers. There was some concern in the last hour before they posted. But I think that was a correct decision, and I would guess if you ask, I think most Americans would agree with that. I'm not sure we should put it to a vote, but I think so. I think they should at least.
Well, Bruce, one of the laws that you've singled out as being misguided in its intent towards government transparency is a California law called the Brown Act. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you see this as sort of a bad example of?
So the Brown Act is an open meeting law that basically says that any public entity, say a city council hearing or a council hearing or a county commission hearing, needs to A, post an agenda, B, cannot discuss any matter between members of the commission out of a public session if it involves a quorum. So if there's, say, 5 people on the city council, 3 of them cannot meet informally and discuss an issue unless it's in public, unless it's been posted, and unless the public can hear and listen. And as I said, it does get enforced. The fact that lots of people aren't prosecuted has a lot to do with the fact that every city has a city attorney, and those city attorneys scare the bejesus out of you and tell you if you do that, you're going to be in trouble. So the reality is that people do adhere to those rules, which means that people don't have conversations at barbecues about what the policy is. And if anybody's ever run a committee or worked in government, you know that if you don't do your work building consensus before the meeting starts and you get in front of the public, people are going to posture. So the Brown Act is a problem. And I think increasingly, as we have the internet age where we can get information out there quickly, we really have to stop and think about whether this increased scrutiny, which is going to be more technologically feasible than ever, is going to improve the quality of our government, given how partisan and divided we've become on so many issues.
Well, Chuck, one of the issues that you have identified is the role of government contractors in sort of enabling government secrecy. Can you tell us just a bit about that?
Yeah, we now have 5 times more contractors at the federal level than we do federal civil service employees. The Freedom of Information Act does not apply to contractors. So finding out who was involved in the nefarious things that happened at Abu Ghraib, you'd have to go to a private company that was contracted to conduct the interrogations in that prison. And so we have this increasingly large black hole of folks doing government's business who actually do not have the same obligations to the public about information. And I happen to think that that's a real problem. And so we have to wait for litigation to come out years later of attempted prosecutions or civil litigation to actually find out the truth about that. I'm an old-fashioned guy. I think the public would be useful to have real-time truth and actually know what's going on relatively in their lifetime, and maybe even in a year or two of something happening. I don't think it's an unreasonable concern. The things that Bruce was just talking about at the local level, I can understand how that would tie a community in knots. I don't dispute that can happen. That still goes back to the 1700s in factionalism. It still comes down to one interested party or a group of them sort of bullying others and trying to deal with that at every municipality. I'm hoping that that's not a typical case for the entire United States. I know every part of America has different variant things about their rules about information. And I think you have cases where folks, seasoned lawmakers, know how to handle this in a fair, reasonable way that doesn't tie them in knots either. I think there's a middle ground here. Rolling back the laws is a very dangerous thing, and we already lost hundreds and hundreds of laws after 9/11 in the name of national security nationwide. I think it's over 1,000 laws were rolled back. So I don't like rolling back laws. It worries me for obvious reasons.
So, Bruce, we have just about 30 seconds left. Where do you see this debate moving in the future? How do you expect things to change over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years?
Oh, I think we're going to be discussing this issue more and more because the reality is that the government knows a lot about you. A lot of private entities know a lot about you. And the whole question of what the government releases not only affects businesses, but it affects your personal life. And if they can't keep that information secret, there's going to be a big problem. So the internet is raising lots of issues because on the internet now, if there are leaks of your social security number or any information that the government has, it can be problematic. So we're going to be talking about these issues for quite a while.
Well, Bruce Kane, Charles Lewis, thanks so much for joining us on Global Journalist. That's going to do it for this edition of Global Journalist. Many thanks to Charles Lewis and Bruce Kane for coming on the program. Global Journalist executive producer is Josh Kransberg, and Travis McMillan of RJI is our studio director. Global Journalist is funded in part by the Lee Hills Chair in Free Press Studies and the University of Missouri School of Journalism. Until next week, for all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure.